It's been a few days now since I've written anything, but the need is there, flailing like a goddamn banshee. Or it is like some torso of another elastic subject or figuration I'll not get to in this piece here, but that wants attention. So I conjure a few extremities, some digits for the extremities to be appropriated by this complicated mutant, and promptly abandon it. Leave the torso unfinished. Jabber on about a new thing. Ha! Well, life is odd about when it's even, fickle about when things go right. It's a rite of passage for those alive at present, and should be seen as a way to determine, at least to a degree, seemingly chaotic instances of errata, somewhat predeterminations of path, whether in a small scheme or a large one. Well, how's that for a subject? Perhaps I sound a bit too devoted to hope yet for chaos, but was I able to keep your attention? It's hard not to be optimistic about failure when it's all the beans you got to make a hill out of. Golly gee, maybe I should indulge asceticism and quit the Dionysian for the Apollonian. I mean, there's this or that I could speak of, but really not much anymore. Not much besides entropy, chaos, torsos. Besides a half smile to be mentioned later. Besides processing thoughts via images, aborting whatever credence might be given to what rages in that mysterious hollow spot between the office walls where the insulation's missing. This mental paucity is outrageous. It's huge as the sky. However, it does not waver, however much the stuff of my bleeding is, however much a weight it is to carry thoughts worrying, this way, that, to collect those damn things with or without virtue, besides what one might spoon out of a clutter of gas into a blind lump of significance masked ugly as the gruel of being, and then to carry all that frivol, all that nastiness past the very last galaxy, the last clusterfuck of uninhabited planets, beautiful units, as like what minutiae might, with a half smile, be observed between persons coy in love, before love's massacre, or at the least persons known a little, but on a larger scale, from the good Lord's penthouse view of all that is. Such things are rather with the smallest meaning given, magnified way beyond the truth of their stature, measurement, to proportions biblically frenetic, even for a creator without bias or sexual orientation. Epicene, pure. The multivaried enigma of weird omnipotence might more ably view, with a massive expression of reflection, the quirks of a quark, made significant, because seen rightly for its purpose, to beautify the universe via the infinite various, moreover via as a supreme extremity of careful arranging by the very ignorant machinations of entropic circumstance. That is, as such things might ruffle on one plane, in turn they might on a bigger macrocosmic level make more sense. And then suddenly, wowed, everybody looks up to behold the magnificence of this goddamn atomic fact, itself only possible via the mistakes of cosmic errata, dismemberments of length and width, for want of a more elaborate breadth. That is, the breadth of stars. Stars either blowing up their gigantic danger into a warpath of a supernova, or intelligent life screwing itself over somewhere else, blowing up its own populous world with nukes. Well, here's the conundrum. Is this jabber just mental masturbation? Or will I fly like a saint all the way out of anguishing, fly out of the mud, this interpreted lagoon, this world of spite, hinging on an next line, yes, a new idea soon to be trashed, however good an idea it was or might have been, I tease, need, boast. I think I know what I am talking about. Must remember, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. That's why I'm never sure beyond the process, perhaps making a seething poetry of the incarnate now, but most likely all this is a dull promise of more fodder for processing, which really is the process itself. How then can it seem like a poet is saying something, anything at all, if his/her subject matter is invisible? Well, I think in the case of this particular writer, it amounts to more than that. I am trying to find clarity, trying to process the scary, scary substances emissions of dreams. And the local meaning thus gets lost in a meaning for all the redundant world, found, for the most part, in infinite music, inherent in such a wonder of non-entity, abstraction, symbol. I'm trying to rip my soul in half. That is, just for the sake of knowing a soul there. Just for the sake of giving the lagoon some air to feed the gas from out the bizarre depths of its troubled water, green and sick with stagnation. I'm ripping like a fucking wizard till the end of my goings, with a hurtling music like a large asteroid of proportions. Bizarre, hurtling parataxis, chaos, havoc, the wrath of a process towards a mode of catharsis, not necessarily through words, gotten through words, as through the ecstasy of commensurate sound, to belt the girth of my skinny skill round, to assuage my anxious need to create and bless the libido, and the spleening courage to pass all things by in these desultory, damn free-form couplets. Thanatos, self-hate, projection. To be real, I do this for the sake of fulfilling a desire I forewent long ago, in dooming myself to process, somewhat, what it is that all thoughts make us mad with, wherein I am made with utterance. Is this the same, with differences about? This poem is like this: snatching something totally fucking destructive, wanting to snatch it for the snake of it, wanting to destroy what I create out of creating it. So there's the kernel of the matter. I cannot write without emphatic expostulations on or negations regarding making the point about a subject, the suggestive subject of destruction's warpath. This is me being honest with myself. I mean, anything I could say about the process would itself be a thought once written. So then if expression in general is static, whatever comes to mind is as real as destruction. The editing process, to me, was and is still sacred. The true shape is found. The old attempted shape is cast off. And yet, as regards what the poem had wanted to be in its beginning stages, well, that urge, the urge a poem has to return again to the energy behind its original motive, encapsulate what inspired it in the first place. That is, be what it had initially started as being, pervades nonetheless throughout the new work, and the spats of that urgency ripple forth still further into the really new work. It is this wedge, this residual rippling forth, that creates discontinuity. That is, the content of what is written is very much unlike the style. What I want to say, struggling, at war with, almost, how I ultimately say it. One tries in the first drafts to match the two. One finds out later that something of either or must be sacrificed in order to make a good poem. That is, content, style. One has to choose. At least, to a point. Pascal maintained that eloquence should fluctuate, and that excessive or continuous eloquence in speech or written down, sadly, inevitably, wearies those listening, looking, reading. The speaker, as such, in his or her failure to keep the attention of his or her audience, is in the eyes of that audience all but completely denuded, laid bare, stripped to the ghastly truth of their own intellectual limitations, a life's knowledge to be forever cultivated. Yes, on the periphery. How terrifying. The man seems to have in mind an audience whom together are to be swept off with you or dragged along. But nonetheless, grandeur must be abandoned to be appreciated. I suppose I take this to mean that excessive eloquence most likely reflects an idea as tiresome and as long-winded as its description, that variations in writing, even from clear to unclear, provide to freshen up one's thoughts regarding the perspective of those listening, looking, reading. Continuous eloquence seems to me detrimental, of course, if one in absorbing what is said is left to eddy with the speaker down a continuum of an endless, monotonous, near hermetic balance between the idea presented and whatever stylistic ideal it conforms to. So then a fugue in writing, or rather a point of aporia, is quite necessary if the writer, especially one like me, is to truly get his or her point across. It is highly ironic. Yes, but also quite wonderful. It is true, good English is a must, as is thought-provoking subject matter. However, at least in my mind, these two things at times are very much irreconcilable, even in violent conflict. The thoughts of people are not so bare as to require a flounce, and yet a sort of cognitive music regarding whatever piece of writing one might speak of has the possibility to better canvas a feeling. Yes, the feeling of speechlessness. The wordless, pictorial, though ultimately fragmented splendor of life. The sides of the divine, that is. What it is that rages around the beauty, with words that by their own eminent limits could not explain splendor as this without sacrificing something of either comprehensibility or tone. I'm speaking mainly of words that in a literal sense do not say much specifically, but rather cascade, flee, circle around the core with a curiosity whelming like a buoy. In a broad sense, words of this nature, convey something of what is sublime, of what is indeed evermore about to be. Via a pattern of thoughts that repeat themselves endlessly, something strange begins to happen. That is, a voice arises, shadowy, speaking for what the words themselves fail to say over and over again. This perpetual failing says more, however, than what could have been made significant and clear if stated once. In an inverted, paradoxical way, I guess I want to make eloquence dithyramic, say a point beyond words, with words that speak for the beyond, attempting, forever attempting, and falling fucking short. In this way, perhaps, the beyond is reached, but reached in reaching, and is then not really a beyond at all. Rather ends up amounting to hopelessly manufactured ersatz eternities, a replication of how the infinite feels, rather than a description of what it is. But perhaps I fail at this as well. And so then most of what I speak of is garbage, the nothingness of psychic trash. But confusion is okay, because it helps us go on. It helps us prize ourselves when whatever caused it is sufficiently deciphered and rectified by us. In such a way I say more about sense and the continual expiation of sense by that which at first let's be honest, who else could these words defend? Fail to explain, make a meaning out of, a sense that is indeed redeemed infinitely, expiated, through varying context wherein the image, even the word in question, might find significance. Like Donne, mine is an attempt, daft, foolish, hopeless, to describe the invisible. A hopelessly, beautifully futile undertaking. Regarding my way of writing, you could say that I freely converse with myself through descant, and at times, subsequently following a poem expressed in one particular vein, palinode, or a recantation of something worked through in that previous poem. Descant being kind of similar, but applied to the whole of one piece, rather. To put it simply in the words of Stevens, and yet, each poem is a conversation. A conversation I'm having with myself, really, vacillating between point and counterpoint, and most of all, never really sure, besides what I learned from how sense might fail me, and thus in failing reinforces skepticism, already merciless, to the point of absolute nihilism, destruction, aporia, literally beyond words, or not knowing truly where to begin as regards the argument at hand. I do this at times to the point of mental exhaustion, and then I give up. This intellectual poverty, somewhat akin to Stevens, usually ends with me hurling out throwing in negations, almost a white flag, saying I do not, will not, cannot. I believe it has poetic value, but also contains some very true stuff. I mean, in terms of sense, logic, as these things might relate to reality. Well, the only way I can see an elliptical, informal logic as this, as what it is, I must see it as an outsider, as a concept, which negates the very in itselfness of what I am conceiving, perceiving. That is, if I must observe logic as such in order to give it meaning, so then it cannot exist in itself. I mean, the only way to find truth really is to lose control. Live for a while in the fugue, and when you do, you'll discover that whatever control you had was needed in order to make what you find comprehensible, in order to give it that value. It's a roundabout way of saying that the reality we cannot see is realer than the reality we can see. And yet, tragically, we cannot see it without losing a sense of control. We cannot see it at all. This very fact makes the reality we perceive more fathomable, realer than that realer reality it is impossible to decipher. Because it's all we can see, it might not mean it's all there is, but at least in our mind's veritable eye we can understand it. This may sound convoluted, but negations often are. Since we're on the topic of reality, it seems suitable to mention how perceptions of it as this relate to art, which to me, speaking generally anyway, is reality. Reality with meaning. But the nature of this meaning is at least partly disparate from whatever it expresses. It relents to fix towards a mystery of impossible, unwieldy strangeness, ultimately as much an affectation as the will, or rather perpetual drive, to perpetually grasp. In this way, the strangeness of art seems different from reality, because the meaning behind a piece of art ends up being more important than the reality it depicts, or lack thereof. In reality, the only thing that is important is reality, because it is not lacking. Art is lacking, because it is not reality. It is an imitation, and so then must convey something beyond itself. Equivocalness is needed in order for one to rightly portray in art a reality that is not equivocal. In other words, meaning is a necessary angel, a brightness of the sun we cannot look at straight, a distortion that paradoxically clarifies. Meaning itself, especially in art, is a symbol as it is an expression. Without symbols, art is seen to us as something manufactured and ersatz and unnatural and ultimately non-fucking sensical. No artistic expression yet has held enough weight to be meaningless, nor is it possible for expression as such to be meaningless, as it is that the sense of our minds, though skewed, when mapped out, expressed in a painting or poem, will always, with enough time and patience, be deciphered in the corners of that painting or poem, even if the expression is merely a symbol for meaninglessness. That, in its way, is a meaning, a distortion. Just as reality itself is strong enough in our minds to not need a reason for existence, is represented by that crucial, simple, atomic fact, our being in the world, is evidence of our existence simply because we exist in it. Art then is too weak a force to go on for very long without symbols. Nothing lives in fiction besides the observed symbol, and characters sprouted from the mind rather than the womb. Sad that we are unable to reconcile meaning with reality, as it is that perhaps they are unified, same things. The same way we cannot have meaning and reality exist as the same thing in a piece of art without the piece losing something valuable. They must be separate in order to be meaningful. In simple terms, art is not reality. It is indeed a defect of the imagination, an obscure bubbling in the swamp. The fact of this is depressing as hell. And yet, in keeping with the good graces of absurdity, I remain hopeful. purpose. Good logic is no sort of human concept. T.S. Eliot talked of a substitute for sense. But to me, if there is a possibility for no sense, there is no possibility for true sense. Besides, in what we're able to garner from context and the appropriation of norms to suit our measureless imagination, my work is the process of a moving forth from one axis to another and back, an exhaling and inhaling, the duality of good and bad. As such, there comes time and time again over the course of a poem when the subject seems hurtling on the stride of its own blank inertia. In order to truly escape one axis and be drawn into another, there must be times of nonsense and absurdity, times between subjects as between stations on a radio, late at night, yawling fuzzbits and guttural mentioning into the dark of the night. Such is a poem of the night. Is puzzling and oblique and ultimately merciful. And this concept of a dispositional axis is a concept of life as much as of literature. Forever will we move on and gain speed, and yet we know not towards what, or for what reason. We'll know only the rapture of the escape from the gravity of an object bigger than our subjects could allow for description, out of a hunger for that feeling of rebirth and eventual slavery by yet another object too big to be settled in a succinct and fitting order. I must, as a result of all this, to say it finally, clearly, find out which element is more applicable regarding making a contiguous linear shape out of what I have just spent time typing out or scribbling down. In other words, I must ask the question, style, content. What's ultimately easier for me to disregard in order to rise the other out of obscure, troubling depth, in order to manufacture grace? Words themselves are creations, manufactured. So then one has no choice but to beautify from an origin quite far from a wordless, senseless reality, beyond sense, beyond words, an origin that is, in this case, to be reflected on, but obviously not grasped. The poet must choose the easier path towards a shape. It is why good poets write with ease. It is why a good poem is graceful, graceful with ease, captivating in the very fluid way it presents, processes, destroys, or transcends itself. If one forces a shape, it'll make it that much harder. The shape feels forced. If one, a poet, that is, writes something and adheres, struggles to adhere to what was contiguous and linear about a poem in its beginning stages, well, that poet will find himself deeper into abstruseness, obscurity. The poet, after all, is as obscure as his words. He goes off all errant. He bogs in the moil of an elliptical, damnable curse, logic's darkest parts, a way of the world that wants too much to make sense of what is no longer sensible. This, I believe, is why discontinuity is so important. Even great poets have ended up talking about something else. Milton's Lycidas darkly speculates on its own author's own premature fate. First, it is an elegy for the early death of an esoteric Latinate scholar named Edward King. Lines written at a country churchyard. At its start, focuses more on imagery and the sensory things of the countryside, which a retired Thomas Gray saw sweep out before him. By the end of the poem, he speaks more on the nature of poetic immortality, the image turning suddenly towards gravestones. The poem, being high romantic, loses focus and is redeemed by that very hesitance on the brink of naming oneself immortal. This hesitance is a strength. It's a phenomenon in poetry that recurs again and again. It is fascinating.